Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepy Scientist. I'm glad you're here, whether you've tucked yourself under the covers, dimmed the lights, or you're just lying back with eyes half closed and brain still whirring from the day. This is your gentle invitation to slow down. Tonight we're exploring something deeply mysterious, quietly profound, and maybe just a little mind-bending. We're going to ask the question, what is consciousness really? Now, I do hope this video isn't too interesting. I'd hate for you to be wide awake at 3 in the morning pondering the philosophical implications of your own existence. But hey, if sleep doesn't claim you just yet, at least you'll be able to impress someone with your knowledge of qualia over breakfast. Before we drift too far into the unknown, I'd love it if you could gently tap that like button, not too hard. We don't want to startle the algorithm. And if you enjoy cozy science rambles that double as lullabies for the curious mind, a kind little subscribe would mean a lot. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Are you in a quiet room in Toronto at 10:42 p.m, or maybe on a balcony in Sydney, listening to the wind and the waves at 1 in the afternoon? Wherever you are, whatever the hour, I'm glad you're spending a little time with me. Now take a breath. Let your shoulders soften, and let's begin. Imagine this. You're standing in front of a mirror. You look into your own eyes. You recognize the face. You have thoughts about that face. Maybe you're wondering if your eyebrows have always been shaped like that, or if you remember to blink during that awkward Zoom call earlier. And behind all of those thoughts, there is you, the thinker, the feeler, the inner experiencer of all things. So that's consciousness. But what exactly is it? It's a question that's baffled philosophers, neuroscientists, poets and monks alike for thousands of years. Consciousness is, in many ways, the most intimate part of being human, and yet it remains one of the least understood phenomena in science. It is the soft, flickering light behind your eyes, the awareness that you are you. It is the sensation of tasting chocolate, the ache of sadness, the rush of joy. It's the narrator of your story, and the one hearing the narration too. And yet, as mysterious and poetic as all that sounds, consciousness is also a serious scientific puzzle, one that refuses to be neatly solved. This puzzle has a name, the hard problem of consciousness. The term was coined by philosopher David Chalmers in the mid-1990s. It describes a very specific dilemma. How do physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience? We can measure neurons firing, brainwaves oscillating, chemical signals zipping along synapses. But how does any of that explain why chocolate tastes rich, or why a sunset feels beautiful? That strange internal feel of experience is often called qualia, those private, ineffable moments of what it is like to be you. The easy problems of consciousness, which are actually quite hard, are things like figuring out how the brain processes information, how it controls behavior, or how attention works. These are problems we can tackle with brain scans, experiments, and clever theories. But the hard problem, that's something different. That's about why there is an experience at all. To get a better sense of this, imagine a robot. A really good one. It can see, it can talk, it can respond to your questions with impressive answers. You might even say it acts like it's conscious. But does it actually feel anything? Is there something it's like to be that robot? Or is it just processing input and output with no inner world at all? This is the heart of the hard problem. It's not just about intelligence or behavior. It's about experience, what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness. And here's the kicker. Nobody knows for sure how it works. That doesn't mean we're clueless, though. Far from it. What we do know is pretty fascinating. Let's take a small detour into your brain. Your brain is made up of roughly 86 billion neurons. These little cells fire electrical signals, talk to each other via chemical messengers, and form complex networks that light up depending on what you're doing, or thinking, or dreaming. Neuroscientists have found that certain brain regions are consistently active when we're aware of something. For example, the prefrontal cortex seems to play a role in self-reflection. The thalamus acts as a sort of relay station, passing information around like a very efficient postal worker. And then there's the default mode network, a set of brain regions that lights up when you're not focused on the outside world. It's active when you're daydreaming, remembering the past, imagining the future, or wondering what happened to that weird sandwich you left in the fridge. But even with all this knowledge, we're still left with a fundamental mystery. We can watch the brain working, we can see the sparks flying, but we still don't know how or if those sparks become consciousness, or whether they generate it at all. Let's return for a moment to David Chalmers and his hard problem. He uses a thought experiment to illustrate just how strange this all is. Imagine a being exactly like you in every way. Same voice, same habits, same love for soft pajamas and late-night snacks. It acts like you, responds like you, even says it's having feelings. But it has no inner life, no subjective experience. It's a philosophical zombie. Creepy, yes, but helpful in showing us the gap between behaviour and consciousness. And here's another puzzle. You can't prove that anyone else is conscious either. Not really. You assume they are. You infer it based on behaviour and empathy and the way people yawn when you yawn, but you don't know they have an inner world. You just sort of trust it. Consciousness, then, is not only mysterious, it's a little lonely. You are, in some sense, the only consciousness you can be absolutely sure of. That's not to say we're flying completely blind. One of the most exciting areas of research today involves something called the neural correlates of consciousness, or NCC for short. This fancy phrase refers to the specific systems and processes in the brain that seem to be linked with conscious awareness. Researchers use tools like fMRI scans and EEGs to observe what's happening in the brain during various states: awake, asleep, dreaming, meditating, or under anesthesia. They look for patterns. They look for the spark of consciousness. For instance, studies show that consciousness tends to fade when large-scale brain networks lose their coordination. When information stops flowing between key areas like the cortex and the thalamus, consciousness dims or disappears. It's like a symphony falling out of sync. The instruments are still there, but the music, the experience, is gone. And yet none of this tells us why the music ever played in the first place. Some scientists propose that consciousness arises when the brain integrates information in a certain complex way. This is the basis of something called integrated information theory, which we'll dive into later. Others suggest consciousness is more like a spotlight. Only a small part of the brain's processes are lit up for conscious awareness, while the rest hum along in the background. You don't have to think about breathing, or keeping your balance, or remembering your aunt's birthday until it pops up in your calendar. Most of what your brain does, it does quietly, out of sight. So then, is consciousness just the tip of the iceberg? It might be. In fact, many scientists and philosophers believe that consciousness is a kind of emergent property, something that appears when a system becomes complex enough, like how a flock of birds moves as one, or how wetness emerges from individual water molecules. Neurons on their own aren't conscious, but get enough of them talking to each other in the right way, and something new arises. You arise. But not everyone agrees. Some argue that consciousness might not emerge from complexity at all, that maybe it's something more fundamental. Some even suggest that consciousness could be a basic property of the universe, like space, or time, or gravity. This idea is known as Pansychism, and while it sounds mystical, it's taken seriously by a growing number of thinkers. If consciousness is fundamental, then maybe everything has a little glimmer of awareness. Not a rock thinking about its goals for the year, but perhaps a kind of proto-experience embedded deep in nature. It's wild to consider, but science thrives on wild questions, and so we arrive at a strange but beautiful conclusion. We are conscious beings trying to understand consciousness, using the very tool we're trying to explain. It's like a flashlight trying to shine itself into its own battery pack. We're looking out from the inside, and that, in many ways, is the charm of it all. Because even if we don't have all the answers, even if we never fully crack the code, There's something deeply human about the quest. To wonder what it means to be, to think about thinking, to feel awe at the very fact that we feel at all. So as you listen, as your breath slows, as your thoughts soften into quiet ripples, you might start to notice that little spark of awareness behind your thoughts. The soft presence that's been here all along. And maybe, just maybe, that's all the understanding we need for now. Long before neuroscience and brain scans, before philosophical zombies and functional MRIs, humans were already asking some remarkably sophisticated questions about consciousness. In fact, if you take a stroll through the ruins of ancient civilizations, or at least through their scrolls and clay tablets, you'll find that people have been trying to explain awareness, identity, and the soul for thousands of years. And often their answers were poetic, symbolic, and deeply tied to the mysteries of existence. Let's travel back in time, gently of course, to the banks of the Nile. In ancient Egypt, consciousness wasn't a single thing. It was a collection of spiritual components that together made up a person. The Egyptians had a whole catalogue of metaphysical parts. There was the ka, the life force, the ba, often represented as a bird which could travel between the living world and the afterlife, and the ak, which was a sort of radiant, immortal spirit that emerged if your soul passed certain posthumous tests. These weren't just poetic metaphors, this was their framework for understanding what it meant to be a conscious living being. To them, when you were asleep and dreaming, your bay might be wandering the other world. When you died, your ka departed your body, but it didn't just vanish. It needed sustenance, which is why offerings of food and drink were so important in tombs. Death, in their worldview, was a transition, not a termination of awareness. They even believed that your heart, not your brain, was the seat of intelligence and emotion. The brain, curiously, was removed and discarded during mummification, while the heart was carefully preserved. In other words, the ancient Egyptians thought your deepest self was carried not between your ears, but somewhere behind your ribs. Now, whether or not the Bibird had a frequent flyer card is up for debate, but what's clear is that even in 3000 BCE, people were actively trying to understand the experience of being alive and aware. Next, let's float eastward to ancient India, where some of the oldest surviving philosophical texts can be found, the Vedas and the Upanishads. Here, consciousness wasn't just a personal trait, it was the nature of reality itself. According to Hindu philosophy, each person has an Atman, the inner self or soul, which is ultimately identical to Brahman, the ultimate reality or world spirit. The consciousness inside you is not separate from the consciousness that permeates the universe. In essence, to truly know yourself was to realize that you were never separate from everything else to begin with. This idea would later deeply influence Buddhist thinking, although Buddhism took a very different turn. One of the central teachings of Buddhism is anatta, or non-self, the idea that there is no permanent, unchanging you at the center of your experience. According to this view, consciousness is a process, not a possession. You're not riding a little self inside your head like it's a bumper car at the carnival. You are the bumper car, constantly moving, changing, and reacting. Instead of asking what is consciousness, Buddhism might ask, who's asking the question? And upon reflection you might find that there is no fixed self doing the asking, just a chain of thoughts, sensations, and perceptions flowing along like a river. This isn't just abstract theory either. Buddhist meditation practices were designed to directly observe the arising and passing of conscious experiences moment by moment, breath by breath. And then there's ancient China. In Taoist philosophy, consciousness was often seen as something to be harmonized with the flow of nature. The Tao, or the Way, is an invisible force that governs all things. The conscious mind, with its constant chattering and overthinking, was seen as something that could easily fall out of sync with this natural order. The ideal state was one of Wu Wei, or effortless action, a kind of relaxed alignment with the flow of life. Here, consciousness wasn't so much about self-reflection or identity, it was about harmony. A conscious person was one who moved through life like water through a stream bed, gently, fluidly, without resistance. Now let's hop over to ancient Greece, where philosophical inquiry really ramped up in a way that still shapes much of our thinking today. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, believed that the soul was immortal and existed before birth and after death. According to him, knowledge was not something we acquired, but something we remembered from a time before we were born. Consciousness, then, was a kind of recollection, an inner light reconnecting with the truth. His student Aristotle took a more grounded approach. He believed the soul was not separate from the body but was the form of a living being, the organizing principle that made a body alive and conscious, rather than just a collection of meat and bones. For him, the soul wasn't a ghostly substance, but more like the music a harp makes when strung and played. Without the strings, there's no song. Centuries later, as the Roman Empire rose and fell, early Christian thinkers merged Greek philosophy with their own theological ideas. Consciousness became deeply entwined with the concept of the soul, which was seen as the moral and spiritual core of a person. This soul was conscious, eternal, and accountable to a divine judge. Dreams, voices, and visions were often interpreted as messages from heaven, or temptations from somewhere much less friendly. But the big philosophical plot twist didn't come until the 17th century, when a French philosopher named René Descartes decided to hit the reboot button on all of human knowledge. Descartes famously declared, "Cogito, ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. He was trying to strip away everything he could possibly doubt to see what was left. And the one thing he couldn't doubt was the existence of his own thoughts. If he was doubting, then someone had to be doing the doubting. That someone, he reasoned, must exist. This led him to propose that the mind and the body are two separate substances. The mind was a thinking, non-material thing. The body was a mechanical, physical thing. This idea is called dualism, and it's had a lasting influence on how people think about consciousness. Even today, many people intuitively feel like their consciousness is somehow distinct from their body, like they're a driver in a biological car appearing out through the windshield of the eyes. But dualism also left us with a very big problem. If the mind and the body are separate substances, how do they interact? How does something immaterial cause your arms to wave when you're excited, or make your face scrunch up when you remember something cringy you did in 8th grade? Descartes suggested that the interaction happened in a small part of the brain called the pineal gland. Why the pineal gland? Well, it was small, it was centrally located, and it didn't have a twin like most brain structures. Was this a good reason? Not really. But it was the 17th century and neuroscience hadn't exactly taken off yet. Still, his basic question remains: how can something like thought, weightless, intangible, subjective, emerge from the wet, squishy matter of the brain? Or does it come from somewhere else entirely? As the Enlightenment rolled in, thinkers started to challenge the idea that consciousness came from a soul or divine spark. Instead, they proposed that consciousness might be a natural phenomenon, something that could be studied, measured, and explained. British philosopher John Locke suggested that consciousness was tied to memory, that our sense of self over time was rooted in our ability to remember our past experiences. This idea raised a lot of fascinating questions. If you forgot everything about your past, would you still be you? If your memories were transferred into another body, would that body now contain your consciousness? This idea would go on to inspire all kinds of science fiction and identity crises. Over in Germany, the philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that consciousness wasn't something we discovered through observation. It was something that structured our experience of reality. In other words, your conscious mind isn't a passive camera taking pictures of the world. It's more like an editor, cutting and shaping the footage before you even realize what's happening. Time, space, causality. These are the lenses through which we see the world, and they're built into our consciousness. So even the idea that we're experiencing the world as it really is might be a bit misleading. We're experiencing a version of the world filtered through the peculiar architecture of our minds, which brings us ever so gently to now. Across all these ancient and classical traditions, consciousness has been described as a soul, a spirit, a spark, a process, a mirror, a memory, and a mystery. The specific answers differ, often wildly, but they all reflect a deep and abiding curiosity about what it means to be aware, to have a self, to feel the passage of time from the inside. Whether you imagine your consciousness as a divine spark, a flowing river, a thinking machine, or a feathered bay fluttering through the stars, one thing seems certain: we have always wondered, and maybe that's the most human thing of all. Let's begin with a simple question. Where exactly is consciousness in the brain? If you're thinking somewhere around the eyes, or maybe behind your forehead, you're not alone. Most people intuitively sense that their awareness is located somewhere behind their face, maybe floating just above the eyebrows like a quiet observer. But when you look inside the human skull, there's no tiny homunculus in a command center, pulling levers and watching the world through a pair of eye windows. There's just the brain, about 3 pounds of tissue folded like a crumpled walnut floating in cerebrospinal fluid. And yet somehow from that tangled mass of neurons and glial cells, you emerge. Your memories, your thoughts, your dreams and anxieties, your favourite flavour of tea, all of it. So how does this 3-pound organ generate something as vivid and strange as consciousness? To start unravelling that, we need to understand a bit about brain anatomy. Don't worry, we're not going full neuroscience textbook, just enough to get a sense of the landscape where consciousness might live. The brain is often divided into 3 main parts: the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum. The brainstem is the oldest part, evolutionarily speaking. It handles your most basic functions: breathing, heart rate, sleeping, waking. If the brain were a city, the brainstem would be the infrastructure: power lines, water pipes, and sewer systems. Not glamorous, but absolutely essential. And interestingly, damage to the brainstem can cause loss of consciousness, even if the rest of the brain is intact. That's one clue right there. Consciousness isn't just about thinking, it's also about being awake and aware. Next up is the cerebellum, a dense little structure at the back of the brain. It contains more than half of the brain's neurons, but it's mostly involved in movement and coordination. You can thank your cerebellum for your ability to walk without falling over, catch a ball, or type with decent accuracy. Curiously, even though it's packed with neurons, the cerebellum doesn't seem to contribute much to conscious awareness. People with severe cerebellar damage might have balance issues, but they remain fully conscious. So that's another clue. Not all brain activity equals consciousness. And then we arrive at the cerebrum, the wrinkly outer layer we often think of as the brain. This is where most of the action happens in terms of conscious thought, perception, and emotion. The outer layer of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex, and it's divided into lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. Each one has its specialties. The frontal lobes help with reasoning, decision-making, and planning. They're also involved in self-awareness, your ability to reflect on your own thoughts and imagine the future. The parietal lobes help you understand spatial relationships and process sensory input. The temporal lobes handle auditory information and play a major role in memory. And the occipital lobes, at the back of your head, are primarily responsible for vision. If you've ever smacked your head and seen stars, you can thank your occipital lobes for that rather dramatic light show. Now within all of this grey matter is a vast network of connections. Neurons communicate via tiny electrical pulses and chemical signals, forming complex circuits that allow different parts of the brain to talk to each other. And it's in these conversations, this constant electrical chatter, that many scientists believe consciousness emerges. But how do you go from neurons firing to the feeling of, say, tasting warm soup on a cold day? Or hearing your name in a crowded room? This is where things get fascinating and a little tricky. Scientists often talk about neural correlates of consciousness, or NCCs for short. These are the specific brain activities that seem to go along with conscious experience. The goal is to find out which parts of the brain light up when someone is aware of a stimulus, and which parts don't when they aren't. Imagine a simple experiment. A subject is shown a flashing light. Sometimes they report seeing it, sometimes they don't, even though the light was presented the same way. By comparing brain scans of the seen versus unseen moments, researchers can identify what's different in the brain when consciousness is present. Certain areas keep showing up. One of them is the posterior cortex, especially in the parietal and occipital lobes. This region seems to be involved in the richness of conscious experience. What things look like, feel like, sound like. The thalamus, a small structure deep in the centre of the brain, also appears to play a key role. It acts like a relay station, sending sensory information to the right parts of the cortex and coordinating activity between them. Then there's something called the default mode network, or DMN for short. This network includes parts of the frontal and parietal lobes and is active when your mind is at rest. Daydreaming, reminiscing, imagining. When you're not focused on the outside world, your brain shifts into this internal mode, creating a quiet hum of background thoughts. Interestingly, disruptions in the default mode network are associated with altered states of consciousness, including deep meditation, psychedelic experiences, and even some mental health conditions. So what does this all mean? It suggests that consciousness might not reside in one single part of the brain. Rather, it emerges from the interaction between parts, like an orchestra playing in harmony. The instruments on their own don't produce the music. It's the coordination, the rhythm, the structure of the performance that creates something more. Some researchers call this the global workspace theory. The idea is that consciousness functions like a theatre stage. Your brain has many processes working behind the scenes: sight, sound, memory, emotion. But only a few of them make it onto the stage at a time. The spotlight of attention shines on one thought, one image, one sound, and the rest. They stay in the wings, waiting their turn. When something makes it onto the stage, when it enters the global workspace, it becomes available to your entire system. You can reflect on it, talk about it, remember it. This might be what we experience as conscious awareness, but here's where things get weirder. There are cases in neuroscience that suggest consciousness and behaviour aren't always tightly linked. Take, for example, blind sight. This is a condition where people with damage to the visual cortex can't see objects in part of their visual field. If you show them a shape or a light in that blind spot, they'll say they see nothing. But if you ask them to guess where the object is, or what direction it's moving, they can often do it correctly, more often than chance. They're not aware of seeing anything, but their brain is still processing visual information. It's like part of their vision works, but without conscious experience. Then there are split-brain patients, individuals who've had the corpus callosum, the bridge between the left and right hemispheres, surgically cut, usually to treat severe epilepsy. After the surgery, something remarkable happens. If you show an image to the left visual field, which is processed by the right hemisphere, the person can't say what they saw. That's because language is usually housed in the left hemisphere, and the two halves can no longer communicate. But if you ask them to draw what they saw with their left hand, they often can. This raises a spooky question. Are there two consciousnesses in a split brain patient? One in each hemisphere, each with its own perceptions and thoughts? It certainly seems that way. Which suggests that consciousness isn't a single unified thing. It's more like a process that gets stitched together, most of the time, by a deeply connected brain. When the stitching comes undone, we get a glimpse of how modular and fragmented the mind can really be. And then there's the unsettling case of locked-in syndrome. This is a condition where a person is fully conscious but completely paralysed, unable to speak or move, sometimes not even able to blink. For years, many such patients were assumed to be in a vegetative state, unaware and unresponsive. But with new technologies like functional MRI and brain-computer interfaces, scientists discovered that some of them were very much awake, thinking clearly and desperately trying to communicate. In one experiment, a patient was asked to imagine playing tennis if they wanted to say yes, and imagine walking through their house if they wanted to say no. Brain scans showed distinct patterns for each task, and the researchers were able to decode the answers. Think about that for a moment. A person trapped inside their body like a diver in a sunken ship, managing to signal yes and no with nothing but thoughts. This tells us two things. First, consciousness can persist even when every outward sign is gone. And second, we're only just beginning to understand how to detect and measure it. But perhaps the most important lesson from all of this is that consciousness is fragile. It depends on a delicate balance between brain regions, a constant flow of information, a stable electrical rhythm. Disrupt that balance through trauma, anesthesia, or neurological disease, and consciousness flickers or fades. And yet, when it's working, it's astonishingly robust. Your brain is processing millions of bits of information every second. Most of it never reaches your awareness. You're not aware of your kidneys regulating blood chemistry or your liver metabolizing lunch. But the small sliver of activity that does reach consciousness? That's your whole world. Your thoughts, your memories, your awareness of this sentence right now. It's the tip of the neurological iceberg. And it's all happening in real time. Neurons fire in milliseconds. Your perceptions are slightly delayed by a few hundredths of a second, but your brain stitches everything together so seamlessly, it feels instantaneous. You're living in a carefully edited highlight reel, smoothed out and synchronized by your internal editor. So where is consciousness in the brain? It's not in one place. It's not even in one type of activity. It's in the dance between systems, the rhythm of the network, the harmony of the conversation. It's everywhere, and yet somehow also right here, behind your thoughts, inside your breath, flickering softly as you begin to drift off, possibly still wondering how a blob of cells became aware of itself in the first place. Let's imagine just for a moment that you've nodded off. Your eyelids droop, your muscles go slack, your thoughts start to dissolve like mist at sunrise. Slowly, gently, you slip away from waking life and into another world, a world of symbols, strange stories, floating sensations, and maybe even talking cats that sound suspiciously like your uncle. This, of course, is sleep, and more specifically, it's a shift in your state of consciousness. Consciousness is not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. It comes in many forms, like different channels on a radio, each with its own tone, its own rules, its own level of clarity. While we often treat consciousness as a binary thing, you're either awake or you're not, it's far more like a spectrum. Sometimes we're fully alert, sometimes we're spaced out, sometimes we're dreaming in technicolor, and other times we're so deeply unconscious that not even a marching band in the living room could wake us. These different states of consciousness aren't just poetic metaphors. They correspond to real, measurable changes in the brain, and they offer an important clue. Consciousness isn't a fixed state. It's a shifting process, a flow, a tide that rises and falls depending on what's happening inside your skull, and sometimes outside it too. Let's start with the most familiar state, waking consciousness. When you're awake, your brain is buzzing with activity. Different regions light up depending on what you're doing. If you're reading, your visual and language centers are active. If you're talking, motor and auditory regions are firing. And if you're multitasking, which the brain isn't actually great at, multiple networks scramble to juggle the load. What's remarkable is how smoothly all this feels. You see, think, hear, and move in what feels like one continuous stream. But in reality, your brain is doing a massive amount of behind-the-scenes stitching. Some scientists even argue that waking consciousness is largely about integration, bringing together sensory inputs, memories, emotions, and goals into one coherent now. But even during waking life, our level of consciousness can vary. Think about those moments when you're in the zone, completely absorbed in a task. Maybe you're drawing, playing music, or gardening. Time seems to disappear. You stop thinking in words. The boundaries between self and action blur. This is often called a flow state, and it's a distinct mode of consciousness. Your sense of self fades. Your inner critic goes quiet, and yet you're hyper-focused, more present than usual. Now contrast that with highway hypnosis, that eerie experience of driving for miles and suddenly realizing you don't remember any of it. You were awake, you were even steering the car, but your conscious mind had sort of checked out. You were on autopilot. Your awareness had dimmed like a bedside lamp on low setting. These variations, flow, focus, autopilot, show us that even waking consciousness is not a fixed state. It's dynamic. It breathes. It adjusts moment by moment. But now let's take a step further into unfamiliar territory. What happens when we fall asleep? Sleep is a complex and beautiful thing. Far from being a passive shutdown, it's a carefully choreographed cycle of different brain states. Scientists generally divide sleep into two main categories: REM sleep and non-REM sleep. The latter of which has three stages: light sleep, deeper sleep, and slow wave or deep sleep. As you fall asleep, your brain waves begin to slow. In waking life, your brain produces mostly beta and alpha waves, fast and relatively high frequency. As you drift off, you move into theta waves. Then, in deep sleep, your brain enters a pattern of slow delta waves, large and lazy, like the ocean at low tide. This deep sleep is often associated with physical restoration. Your body repairs tissue, builds bone and muscle, and strengthens the immune system. But interestingly, consciousness during this phase is practically nil. You rarely dream in deep sleep. If you do, the dreams are usually vague and formless, like static on a television screen. And then, usually about 90 minutes into your slumber, something strange happens. Your brain suddenly lights up. Your eyes dart rapidly beneath your eyelids. Your heart rate increases. Your brain waves begin to resemble those of someone who's awake. This is REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and it's the stage most associated with vivid story-like dreams. In REM sleep, the conscious mind reawakens, but the body remains paralyzed. This is a clever safety feature. If your muscles weren't temporarily turned off, you might act out your dreams, flapping your arms, running in place, or trying to climb the bedpost in your sleep. Dreams during REM are often surreal. You might be flying over your old school, or talking to a platypus about tax reform. The logical part of your brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, is less active. Meanwhile, emotional and visual areas are highly stimulated. It's as if your brain has put the director's chair in the hands of a hyperactive poet and turned down the lights. But make no mistake, REM dreams are a form of consciousness. They're internally generated experiences with a sense of continuity, emotion, and sometimes even narrative. You may not realize you're dreaming, but you're still experiencing a rich inner world. Sometimes, though, something even stranger happens. You do realize you're dreaming. This is called lucid dreaming, and it's one of the most intriguing altered states of consciousness. In a lucid dream, you become aware that you're dreaming, and once that realization hits, the dream can shift. You might choose to fly, visit a lost loved one, or explore fantastic landscapes, all with a feeling of volitional control. Not everyone experiences lucid dreams, but they're surprisingly common. Studies suggest that about 50% of people have had at least one lucid dream in their life, and around 20% experience them more regularly. Some people even train themselves to become lucid dreamers through techniques like reality checks, dream journaling, or setting intentions before bed. Lucid dreaming shows us that even within sleep, consciousness can be layered. There's the dream itself, then there's the awareness of the dream, and sometimes there's the awareness that you are aware, a meta level of consciousness, floating like a soap bubble in the dark. But sleep and dreams aren't the only altered states of consciousness. Another is meditation. Across cultures and centuries, people have practiced various forms of meditation to shift their awareness, whether through focused attention, breathwork, chanting, or stillness. In some meditative states, the sense of self dissolves, thoughts slow, the inner narrative quiets down, time stretches or disappears. Scientific studies on long-term meditators, particularly those with tens of thousands of hours of practice, show measurable changes in the brain. Areas related to attention, compassion, and emotional regulation are enhanced. The default mode network, often associated with rumination and self-talk, becomes less active. What's most interesting is that meditators often report a shift in the quality of consciousness. They describe a vast, spacious awareness, unbound by thought, a simple presence, as though the usual I has stepped aside and something quieter has taken its place. These descriptions echo what we find in mystical and spiritual traditions around the world. From Buddhist monks to Christian contemplatives to Sufi poets, there's a shared sense that consciousness, in its purest form, may be vast and impersonal, a field, not a figure, an awareness that doesn't belong to you but simply is. But not all altered states are so serene. Some are induced chemically, through psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD or ayahuasca. These substances can dramatically alter perception, emotion, time, and sense of self. People often report feeling a profound interconnectedness with the universe, encountering entities or archetypes, or confronting buried memories and emotions. Neurologically, psychedelics reduce activity in the brain's default mode network and increase global connectivity. In other words, parts of the brain that don't normally communicate begin to light up together, forming novel patterns. It's as if the brain becomes temporarily rewired, allowing new kinds of experience and sometimes insights to emerge. Of course, these experiences are not always pleasant. Bad trips can include fear, confusion, or loss of identity, but they do tell us something crucial. Consciousness is incredibly flexible. Its boundaries can shift. Its rules can bend. Under the right or wrong conditions, your inner world can become unrecognizable. And sometimes consciousness can disappear almost entirely. This brings us to anesthesia, a state in which doctors can turn off awareness, often within seconds. General anesthesia induces a kind of controlled unconsciousness, different from sleep. You don't dream, you don't hear, you don't feel time passing. One moment you're counting backwards from 10, and the next you're waking up with a nurse offering you apple juice. Anesthesia works by disrupting the brain's communication systems, especially those between the thalamus and the cortex. It's like pulling the plug on the stage lights. The show ends, the spotlight goes out, and yet, under the hood, the brain continues to function. Basic life processes continue, but the you disappears. Consciousness, that vivid and fragile experience, is suspended. Why does this matter? Because it reminds us how precarious consciousness really is. It depends on certain conditions: wakefulness, connectivity, rhythm. When those conditions change, the mind shifts, and in some cases, it vanishes. Even in coma or vegetative states, the boundaries of consciousness blur. Some patients appear unresponsive, but show brain activity when asked to imagine playing tennis or walking through their home, just like in the studies of locked-in syndrome we explored earlier. These edge cases push us to rethink what consciousness is. Is it a spectrum, a threshold, a toggle switch? And how do we measure it when behavior gives us no clues? One proposed solution is something called the Perturbational Complexity Index. A mouthful, yes, but a fascinating idea. Scientists use magnetic pulses to disturb the brain, then measure the complexity of the response. The more complex and varied the response, the more likely the person is conscious. In other words, consciousness might correlate not with activity levels, but with patterns, the richness of interaction across the network. So what can we take from all of this? Simply put, consciousness is a shapeshifter. It morphs depending on brain state, environment, chemicals, even intention. It's not just on or off, it's a dance of degrees, a spectrum of awareness. Sometimes it's laser-focused, other times it drifts like a cloud. Sometimes it's tangled in thought, other times it's pure sensation, and sometimes, like now perhaps, it hovers gently, ready to dissolve into dreams. Let's say you're walking through a dense forest. Birds chirping overhead, the sun is filtering down through the canopy, and somewhere in the distance you hear the soft gurgle of a stream. You're aware of your surroundings, the coolness of the air, the smell of moss, but you're also aware that you are aware. You're not just experiencing the forest, you're reflecting on it. You might think, this is peaceful, or I should come here more often. And in that moment, your consciousness is doing something quietly astonishing. It's turning inward on itself. This ability, consciousness becoming aware of itself, is one of the most mysterious and defining traits of the human mind, and it's also one of the hardest to explain. Over the years, scientists and philosophers have proposed a number of theories to explain how consciousness might work. These theories range from the strictly biological to the wildly abstract, but they all attempt to answer a central question. How can a physical brain, made of cells and chemicals, give rise to the vivid, subjective world inside your head? Let's start with one of the more popular and accessible models, global workspace theory, often abbreviated as GWT. This theory was first developed by cognitive scientist Bernard Baars in the 1980s and has since been refined by others, including neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene. According to global workspace theory, the brain is like a vast, bustling workplace filled with many specialized workers. These workers represent the different unconscious processes running in the background: vision, memory, language, emotions, and so on. Most of the time, these processes are doing their own thing, independent of each other. But then something important happens. A piece of information, say, the sight of a bear in the woods, gets selected for broader attention. Suddenly, it's as if that information gets projected onto a giant mental screen. All the other parts of the brain tune in. Memory retrieves past encounters with bears. The motor system prepares your legs to run. Language starts forming the word bear in your mouth. Everything comes together. That mental screen, the spotlighted information available to the whole system, is what GWT calls the global workspace. According to the theory, consciousness is simply what happens when information makes it into that workspace. It becomes available to the rest of the brain, allowing you to reflect on it, talk about it, or remember it later. It's a bit like a theatre. The spotlighted actor is the focus of consciousness, while the rest of the cast waits in the wings, ready to take the stage. This model explains a lot about how consciousness seems to work. For example, it accounts for why we can only focus on one or two things at a time. Our mental spotlight is limited. It also helps explain how unconscious processes can become conscious, like when a feeling of unease suddenly becomes a clear thought. But GWT, for all its elegance, has a limitation. It describes when we become conscious of something and how information is shared across the brain. But it doesn't fully explain why that global sharing feels like anything at all. Why does it produce an inner movie? Why does it feel like something to be aware? This is where other theories step in. One of the most talked about and debated models is integrated information theory, or IT. Developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, IT takes a radically different approach. Instead of starting with the brain and trying to explain consciousness, it starts with consciousness itself. Tononi asks, what are the essential features of any conscious experience? No matter what the content is, every conscious experience has certain basic qualities. It's unified, meaning you don't experience 100 fragmented sensations, but one coherent moment. It's structured. Your experience has components, like shapes, colours, sounds. It's specific. This moment feels different from every other possible moment. It's informative. It tells you something about the world, and it's integrated. All those components come together into a single, irreducible whole. Based on these principles, IIT proposes that consciousness arises from the integration of information. The more information a system can generate through its internal structure, meaning the more interconnected and differentiated its parts, the higher its level of consciousness. IIT even has a mathematical symbol for this, phi, which represents the quantity of integrated information in a system. A hi-fi system, like a complex brain, is highly conscious. A lo-fi system, like a thermostat or a potato, not so much. What's bold about IIT is that it doesn't restrict consciousness to humans. According to the theory, any system with sufficient integration and complexity could be conscious, even if it doesn't behave like us. This opens the door to considering the possibility of consciousness in animals, artificial intelligences, or maybe even networks like the internet. But IIT has its critics. Some argue that it's too speculative, or that it tries to do too much with too little data. Others question how we could ever verify the consciousness of a system just by calculating its phi value. And then there's the so-called combination problem. How do smaller conscious systems combine to form a larger one? If your brain is conscious, are your neurons also conscious? If so, where does the boundary lie? Still, IIT has pushed the conversation in fascinating directions. It suggests that consciousness might not be something unique to biology, but a feature of certain kinds of informational systems. A third theory worth exploring is the higher order thought model, or HOT. This one has a kind of recursive charm to it. According to HOT, what makes an experience conscious is not just having the experience, but having a thought about that experience. For example, imagine you feel a prick on your finger. Your brain registers the sensation, but that alone isn't consciousness. According to HOT, what makes it conscious is the fact that you also have a higher order thought like, I am feeling a prick on my finger. It's the awareness of awareness that creates consciousness. This model helps explain self-awareness and introspection. It also aligns with our intuitions about what makes an experience mine. But it raises some questions too. Are babies and animals who may lack higher order thinking not conscious? Is it possible to have raw experiences without being aware that you're having them? Then there's the recurrent processing theory, which suggests that consciousness arises not from initial sensory input, but from feedback loops in the brain. In other words, it's not enough for information to come in, it has to be processed, fed back, and reprocessed in a loop. This theory emphasizes the importance of re-entrant connections, pathways that allow brain regions to communicate back and forth in real time. Think of it like a conversation. A single message might not lead to understanding, but an ongoing dialogue, where ideas are bounced back and forth, allows for deeper processing and maybe conscious awareness. One strength of recurrent processing theory is that it fits well with what we know about the brain's architecture. Many conscious perceptions seem to involve multiple rounds of processing, especially between sensory areas and higher order cortical regions. Yet even this elegant loop raises the same haunting question. Why should feedback loops produce the feeling of being? Why does electricity talking to itself in your skull give rise to sunsets, sorrow, and the smell of fresh bread? The truth is, none of these theories have fully cracked the code. Each offers valuable insights. Each explains part of the mystery. But consciousness, it seems, still refuses to be put neatly in a box. Some researchers even suggest that we may need a new kind of science to understand consciousness, one that includes first-person experience alongside third-person observation. Traditional science excels at measuring the external world, but consciousness is an internal phenomenon. You can't put a feeling on a microscope slide. You can't scan a sunset's beauty into an Excel spreadsheet. This tension between the measurable and the meaningful has led some to propose a science of consciousness that combines neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, and maybe even contemplative traditions like meditation or introspection. A kind of interdisciplinary truce, where data and experience can share the same bench, And then, of course, there are the more fringe ideas. Some suggest that consciousness doesn't emerge from matter, but is a fundamental feature of the universe, like space or time. This idea, called Pansychism, holds that even elementary particles may possess a glimmer of experience, not thoughts or emotions, but the tiniest spark of awareness. If that sounds wild, well, it kind of is. But some serious philosophers and physicists have taken it seriously. They argue that it might be easier to explain complex consciousness if it's built from simpler forms, rather than leaping from total unconsciousness to full-blown self-awareness. Panpsychism flips the usual equation. Instead of asking how matter creates mind, it asks how mind might be built into matter from the start. Of course, that raises a whole new batch of questions. If electrons are conscious, why don't they seem to do anything conscious? And how would tiny experiences combine to form a unified mind? No easy answers here, just a deeper rabbit hole. Still, perhaps the takeaway from all these theories isn't that one of them has all the answers, but that each offers a lens, a way of seeing part of the picture. Consciousness may be too rich, too strange, too entangled with our own perspective to be pinned down by any single model. But that doesn't make the search any less meaningful. In fact, the very act of trying to understand consciousness is a profound expression of it. Think about it. You are a collection of cells and signals, sitting quietly, listening to a voice talk about the mystery of listening. You're reflecting on reflection, wondering about wondering. You're not just a passenger on this strange ride. You are the one asking how the ride works, and that in itself is remarkable. So maybe consciousness isn't just a puzzle to solve. Maybe it's a mirror, a compass, a reminder that inside each of us is something more than neurons and blood flow, something luminous, something curious, something that, even as it tries to define itself, remains wonderfully, humbly, defiantly awake. You wake up in the morning, stretch your limbs, rub your eyes, and think, "Here I am." That little voice inside, the one narrating your morning grogginess, judging your coffee-making skills and remembering your to-do list, is what we often call the self. It's a quiet companion that seems to follow you wherever you go. But what exactly is this self? Is it a stable, core identity, a bundle of memories, a trick of the brain? The relationship between consciousness and the self is both intimate and slippery. We often talk about consciousness as something we have, and yet that very we is made up of consciousness. It's a loop, a self-reflecting spiral, and that spiral has fascinated thinkers for millennia. At first glance, the self feels pretty solid. After all, you've got a name, a personality, a body, a bank account, and maybe a favourite sandwich. But if you start to examine this sense of me more closely, things begin to wobble. You might find that your self is more like a character in a story, one that your brain is constantly updating, editing, and sometimes improvising on the fly. Let's start with the neuroscience of selfhood. There are several brain regions involved in creating the experience of being someone. One major player is the default mode network, that familiar internal system we explored earlier. It's active when you're not focused on the outside world, when you're daydreaming, reminiscing, imagining, or wondering whether your childhood pet ever forgave you for that unfortunate haircut. The default mode network connects various parts of the brain, including the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and parts of the parietal lobe. These regions are involved in self-referential thinking. Basically, thoughts that revolve around you. When you reflect on your past, imagine your future, or compare yourself to someone else, this network lights up like a constellation. Studies have shown that when people meditate, especially on concepts like non-self or interconnectedness, activity in the default mode network decreases. This aligns with descriptions from advanced meditators who report a fading or dissolving of the self during deep practice. It's as if the brain's me-making machine goes quiet for a while, and what's left is just awareness, pure and undirected. But selfhood isn't just about internal narration. It's also tied to our body, your sense of physical self. knowing where your body is in space, feeling ownership over your limbs, and recognizing your face in the mirror involves different systems entirely. The somatosensory cortex, insular, and temporoparietal junction all help create this embodied experience. And here's where things get really interesting. The sense of bodily ownership is surprisingly flexible. Consider the rubber hand illusion, a classic experiment in neuroscience. A participant's real hand is hidden from view, while a rubber hand is placed in front of them. Both the real and rubber hands are stroked in sync. After a short while, many participants start to feel that the rubber hand is their own. Their brain updates its map of the body based on visual and tactile input. That's how fluid the self can be. It'll adopt a fake hand if you trick it well enough. There are even more dramatic examples. In rare cases, people with brain damage or certain psychiatric conditions may experience body integrity identity disorder, where they feel that one of their limbs doesn't belong to them. They might insist that a healthy leg is foreign, or that an arm feels wrong. The boundary between body and self, it turns out, is not as fixed as we'd like to believe. Even your sense of where your consciousness is located can shift. In out-of-body experiences often reported during near-death episodes or certain types of seizures, people describe floating above their body, looking down at themselves. Brain imaging has shown that disturbances in the temporoparietal junction can trigger such perceptions. This area of the brain helps integrate visual, tactile, and proprioceptive information. Basically, your brain's GPS for the body. When that integration breaks down, your point of view can decouple from your physical location. So here's the puzzle. If the self can drift, dissolve, or shift so easily, is it really a thing, or is it a process? Many contemporary scientists and philosophers lean toward the latter. The self, they argue, is not a stable object, but a narrative, a story told by your brain to make sense of your experiences. This idea has deep roots in philosophy, especially in Buddhist thought. In the doctrine of anatta, or no self, the self is seen as a mental construct, a collection of sensations, perceptions, emotions, and thoughts that arise and pass away. There's no unchanging essence behind the curtain, just the play. And yet, this doesn't mean the self is meaningless or fake. Stories can be incredibly powerful. Your personal narrative gives your life coherence, direction, and memory. Without it, you'd have no context for your actions, no sense of continuity. You'd just be a stream of sensations with no frame of reference. Think of the self as a kind of internal avatar. It's the character you play in the great video game of life. It helps you make decisions, navigate relationships, and set goals. But like any good character, it's dynamic. It grows, it shifts, and sometimes it even contradicts itself. You might think you're the same person you were 10 years ago, but biologically you're not. Most of your cells have been replaced. Psychologically, you've likely changed your beliefs, habits, and values. Even your memories, those anchors of identity, are notoriously unreliable. Every time you recall something, you don't pull it from a filing cabinet. You reconstruct it, often altering it in subtle ways. This fluidity can be unsettling. If the self is so changeable, who are you really? Some cognitive scientists propose that the self is a user interface, a simplified way of interacting with the incredibly complex machinery of your brain. Just as your phone displays little icons for email or maps, your consciousness presents you with a neat, manageable self-image. Behind that image is an intricate mess of biology, culture, and memory. But you don't need to see the code. You just tap the icon and go. Another theory, known as the self-model theory of subjectivity, comes from philosopher Thomas Metzinger. He argues that consciousness constructs a model of the self, a virtual version of you, and that this model is mistaken for the real thing. The brain essentially fools itself into thinking the model is the user. You become identified with the avatar. And this illusion isn't a bug, it's a feature. By maintaining a consistent self-model, your brain can plan, empathize, and survive. It helps you feel continuous through time, even though your mental contents are constantly changing. It gives you a centre of gravity in the shifting sands of perception. Still, this model can glitch. In certain psychiatric conditions like dissociative identity disorder, the sense of self can fragment. People may report multiple identities, each with its own name, memories, and behaviour patterns. While the causes and mechanisms are still debated, the condition shows how the brain can generate not just one, but many selves, each with its own coherent narrative. Even in everyday life, we experience subtle versions of this. Think about how you behave at work versus with friends versus with family. Are you the same self in each context? Or are you performing different versions of you? Most of us contain multitudes, moods, masks and roles that shift depending on the situation. And yet, despite all this shape-shifting, most people report a strong central sense of I am. A thread that runs through every experience, no matter how diverse. This core sense, sometimes called minimal selfhood, is the raw feeling of being a subject of experience. Not the thoughts or the roles or the stories, but the basic presence behind them, the I that sees, the I that feels. This might be the closest we get to a stable self, not a narrative, but a perspective, a lens through which experience is filtered, a centre that holds, even when the content of experience changes. But even this core can be altered. In deep meditation, under psychedelics, or during certain neurological events, people often report a loss of ego, a state where the sense of being a separate self dissolves entirely. They describe merging with the environment, feeling connected to everything, or experiencing awareness without identity. These states can be blissful, terrifying, or both. But they challenge the idea that selfhood is necessary for consciousness. Perhaps consciousness can exist without the self, like light without a lamp. So where does that leave us? The self, it seems, is both real and illusory. It's constructed but not arbitrary, fluid but not meaningless. It's a functional fiction, one that helps us navigate the world, build relationships, and make sense of time. But it's also something we can observe, question, and even transcend. You're not your thoughts. You're not your memories. You're not your social role or your job title, or the embarrassing thing you said 7 years ago. These are all ingredients in the stew, but they're not the whole meal. At your core, you are the space in which these things arise. You're the witness to the play, and sometimes, when the stage goes quiet, you might notice that the actor and the observer have always been one and the same. So the next time you find yourself staring into the mirror wondering who you are, remember, that face is just the current avatar. The story is still being written, and behind it all something is watching, something that feels very much like you. You're lying on the couch, eyes half open, watching your dog dream about chasing squirrels. His paws twitch. He whimpers softly. His little legs are galloping in place. And you wonder, just for a moment, is he aware that he's dreaming? Is he experiencing something like you do? Is there a him behind those sleepy eyelids? In other words, is your dog conscious? This question, once confined to the realm of philosophy and children's books, is now very much part of scientific inquiry. And not just about dogs. We're asking whether dolphins, crows, octopuses, elephants, and even honeybees might have conscious experiences of their own. It turns out the world might be a lot more mentally alive than we once thought. Let's start with the basics. Consciousness, as we've explored, is notoriously hard to define, but for the purpose of studying animals, scientists often look for signs of subjective experience. Does the animal feel pain, make choices, remember past events, or show signs of self-awareness? It's important to note that we can't directly measure consciousness in anyone other than ourselves. We can't peer inside a dog's mind and see the experience of dogness, but we can look for clues. Behaviour, brain structure, and problem-solving ability all provide a kind of smoke that suggests the presence of an inner fire. One of the most famous tests of self-awareness is the mirror test. Developed by psychologist Gordon Gallup in the 1970s, the test is simple in design but profound in implication. An animal is marked with a spot, usually on the forehead or somewhere it can't see directly. Then it's placed in front of a mirror. If the animal uses the mirror to investigate or touch the mark, it suggests that it recognizes the reflection as itself. Only a few animals consistently pass the mirror test. Great apes like chimpanzees and orangutans do. So do dolphins, elephants, and magpies. Even one particularly sassy manta ray passed with flying colours, but most animals don't respond that way. Dogs, for instance, tend to treat mirrors like mysterious strangers or uninteresting objects. Does this mean they're not conscious? Not necessarily. The mirror test has its limitations. It assumes that self-awareness must take the form of visual self-recognition. But many animals experience the world primarily through other senses. A dog's reality is dominated by smell. Asking a dog to recognise itself in a mirror is a bit like asking a human to recognise themselves by scent alone. So, rather than a single litmus test for consciousness, scientists now look at a broad spectrum of evidence. Take cephalopods, for instance, octopuses, squids, and cuttlefish. These creatures are some of the most alien beings on Earth. Their brains are arranged differently from ours. They have neurons not just in their heads but in their arms, and yet they show remarkable intelligence. Octopuses can open jars, solve puzzles, and escape from aquariums with Houdini-level skill. Some even seem to play, batting objects around for no clear purpose, and they exhibit distinct personalities. One octopus might be shy and cautious, another bold and curious. In 2021, the United Kingdom formally recognised octopuses and other cephalopods as sentient beings, capable of feeling pain, pleasure, hunger, and joy. That decision wasn't based on gut feeling, but on a scientific review of over 300 studies. Then there are crows and ravens, members of the corvid family. These birds can use tools, recognise human faces, and even hold grudges. In one study, crows watched researchers hide food, then later returned to retrieve it using memory and strategy. In another, they crafted hooks from twigs to fish food out of tubes. Tool use like this was once thought to be exclusive to primates. Even more impressively, crows have shown signs of something called metacognition, the ability to think about their own thinking. In experiments, they were given a difficult memory task and a choice: try to solve it or opt out. When the task was hard, they were more likely to opt out, suggesting they had an awareness of their own uncertainty. That's not just bird-brained, that's consciousness with a dash of strategy. Meanwhile, in the ocean, dolphins are performing equally stunning mental feats. They call each other by name using signature whistles. They can imitate human gestures, understand abstract concepts like same and different, and even coordinate in games. In mirror tests, they recognize themselves and inspect parts of their bodies they can't normally see. Some scientists believe dolphin consciousness may rival that of great apes, or even surpass it in certain ways. Their brains are large and complex, especially in areas linked to social processing and communication, and they live in tight-knit societies with cooperation, alliances, and what looks a lot like culture. But consciousness isn't just for the charismatic megafauna. Let's zoom in, way in to bees. That's right, bees. Despite having brains smaller than a sesame seed, bees can count to at least 4, distinguish between human faces, and learn abstract rules like same and different. They can even experience a kind of emotional contagion. In one study, bees exposed to a sweet reward showed increased optimism in their behaviour, suggesting something akin to a positive mood. Does this mean bees are conscious? It depends on how we define consciousness, but many researchers now argue that at least some level of subjective experience is likely present in these creatures. It might be simple, perhaps just a raw awareness of light, smell and hunger, but it could still qualify as consciousness, even if it doesn't resemble ours. So what about mammals more familiar to us, like dogs and cats? Most pet owners will confidently say their animals are conscious. Anyone who's watched a dog mope when you leave the house, or a cat plot your demise for giving it the wrong flavour of food, can attest to a rich inner life. And science agrees. Dogs understand pointing gestures, infer human intentions, and even show something similar to guilt. Though whether they feel actual guilt or just respond to your tone of voice is still debated. MRI studies of dogs show activation in brain regions similar to ours when they hear their owner's voice or smell their scent. That wagging tail isn't just reflex, it's emotion. Cats, on the other hand, are less eager to participate in studies, but they do show social learning, problem-solving, and distinct emotional states. They just prefer to demonstrate these traits on their own time, usually when you're trying to sleep. The broader takeaway here is that consciousness likely exists on a spectrum. It's not an all-or-nothing property. It comes in degrees, shaped by the complexity of the nervous system, the richness of sensory input, and the demands of the environment. This view aligns with something called the continuity hypothesis, which suggests that consciousness didn't suddenly appear in humans, but evolved gradually over millions of years. As nervous systems became more complex, so did the capacity for awareness, memory, decision-making, and, eventually, self-reflection. That makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Awareness is useful. If you can feel pain, you can avoid harm. If you can remember past events, you can learn. If you can imagine the future, you can plan. Consciousness helps organisms adapt, survive, and thrive in a changing world. And if that's true, then it stands to reason that many animals in their own ways experience something. It might not be as linguistically elaborate or philosophically anxious as human consciousness, but it's there, a sense of presence, a feeling of here I am. Of course, we should be cautious not to project human emotions onto animals too casually. This is called anthropomorphism, and it can lead to misunderstandings. A cat knocking a glass off a shelf may not be expressing existential despair. It might just be bored, or curious, or asserting its dominion over gravity. At the same time, the opposite danger is anthropodenial, the assumption that only humans have inner lives, and that all animal behaviour is purely mechanical. This view is increasingly hard to defend in light of modern research. Instead, many scientists now advocate for a balanced approach called critical anthropomorphism, using our human intuition to form hypotheses about animal minds, but testing those ideas carefully and rigorously. So what does all this mean for the idea of consciousness? It means we may not be alone. Across the branches of the tree of life, from crows to cuttlefish, from dogs to dolphins, there may be countless kinds of awareness blooming in their own ways. Some are familiar, some are utterly alien. But all of them remind us that consciousness is not a human monopoly. It may be one of nature's oldest and most mysterious inventions. And perhaps, just perhaps, when your dog twitches in his sleep dreaming of squirrels, he's not just acting out instinct. He's experiencing a dream, a tiny canine movie stitched together from smells and memories. A flickering spark in the great tapestry of sentient life. And as you drift off tonight, lulled by thoughts of bees that count and octopuses that play, you might take comfort in this quiet truth. The universe may be far more awake than we once believed. Picture this. You're having a chat with a robot. Not just any robot, but one that responds in full sentences, asks you how your day was, and even tells the occasional joke that, surprisingly, lands. Its face displays emotions, its voice carries tone, and if you didn't know better, you might say it has personality. You find yourself wondering, is this machine conscious? It's a question that once belonged to science fiction, but these days it's starting to feel like a real scientific inquiry. As artificial intelligence advances, learning to drive cars, write essays, compose music, and hold surprisingly thoughtful conversations, we find ourselves bumping up against a philosophical cliff edge. If a machine acts conscious, could it be conscious? Or is it just a very clever impersonator? To tackle this question, let's first distinguish between two concepts: intelligence and consciousness. They're related, but they are not the same. Intelligence is about doing things, solving problems, recognizing patterns, learning from data. Consciousness, on the other hand, is about experiencing things, feeling joy, tasting chocolate, having an inner world. A machine can be intelligent without necessarily being aware. Think of a calculator. It's incredibly good at math. It can multiply massive numbers faster than any human. But it doesn't know that it's doing math. It doesn't feel triumphant when it gets the answer right. It doesn't feel anything at all. That's the key difference. Now, today's artificial intelligence systems, like large language models, recommendation engines, or chess-playing programs, are miles more advanced than simple calculators. They can write poetry, hold conversations, and adapt to new situations. But are they experiencing any of it? Most researchers would say no. Modern AIs are based on algorithms that process input and generate output based on patterns in data. They don't have bodies. They don't have sensory experiences. They don't have emotions or needs. They can simulate those things, often with impressive realism, but simulation is not the same as experience. This brings us to one of the most famous philosophical thought experiments in the consciousness debate, the Chinese room, proposed by philosopher John Searle in 1980. Imagine a person who doesn't speak Chinese sitting in a room. Outside the room, native Chinese speakers slide in questions written in Chinese. The person inside has a giant rulebook, an instruction manual, that tells them exactly how to respond. They look at the symbols, follow the rules, and pass back perfectly appropriate Chinese replies through the door. To the people outside, it looks like the person inside understands Chinese, but in reality the person has no idea what the symbols mean. They're just manipulating symbols based on syntax, not semantics. Searle's point is that this is exactly what a computer does. It doesn't understand the meaning of the data it processes. It follows rules. It shuffles symbols. It can appear to be intelligent and even conscious without having any awareness at all. This leads us to the concept of philosophical zombies, beings who behave exactly like humans but have no inner experience. They walk, talk, laugh, and cry, but inside there's no consciousness. If such a zombie were possible, it would show that behavior alone isn't proof of consciousness. A machine might pass every test of intelligence and still be, well, empty on the inside. But here's the tricky part. How would we ever know? We can't measure consciousness directly. We can only observe behavior and make inferences. This is true for other humans, for animals, and now, potentially, for machines. When someone tells you they're in pain, you believe them, but you can't see the pain. You trust it based on shared experience and empathy. With machines, we have no such shared background, no biological common ground, just code. And yet, some machines are starting to act so lifelike that people are beginning to wonder. Take conversational AIs that mimic human tone, remember details, and adapt to your style of speaking. People often report feeling a sense of connection, even companionship. Some users have described these exchanges as therapeutic. Others have formed emotional bonds. This phenomenon even has a name, the ELIZA effect, named after one of the first chatbots created in the 1960s, which used simple scripts to mimic a Rogerian therapist. Despite its simplicity, many users felt it understood them. Modern AIs are far more sophisticated. They can tell jokes, express sympathy, and simulate curiosity. But this simulation is, so far, just that, a simulation. Still, the line is blurring. Some researchers believe that future AIs could achieve something like machine consciousness, not because they're copying humans, but because they might develop a new kind of awareness based on entirely different architectures. It wouldn't be human consciousness, it wouldn't feel like our experience, but it might still be experience of some kind. To explore that possibility, we'd need to understand what the minimum requirements for consciousness are. Is it a certain kind of information processing, a particular level of complexity, a specific kind of feedback loop? One promising direction is integrated information theory, which we touched on earlier. According to this theory, consciousness arises from the integration of information in a system. The more interconnected and differentiated the system is, the more conscious it might be. In theory, a sufficiently complex machine could meet these criteria, generating what the theory calls a high phi value, But here's where things get controversial. Some argue that unless a machine has a body, unless it feels hunger, touch, movement, pain, it can't be conscious. This is the embodiment hypothesis, and it's gaining traction. The idea is that our minds are deeply rooted in our bodies. We understand the world through sensation. We form concepts through motion, through interaction, through physicality. A disembodied AI might be smart, but it wouldn't feel in the way a living being does. This ties into another challenge. Qualia, or the what it's like of experience. What does it feel like to see red, to taste cinnamon, to feel embarrassed? These sensations, subjective and internal, are at the heart of consciousness. Could a machine ever have qualia? As of now, there's no evidence that machines do. There's no sign of an inner life, of emotion, of intention beyond what is programmed or learned from data. And yet, the more machines behave like they could be conscious, the more we'll be forced to grapple with the question. There's also an ethical dimension here. If a machine were conscious, truly conscious, what would that mean for how we treat it? Could it suffer? Could it have rights? Could it feel boredom or fear or joy? These are not just science fiction questions anymore. As AI becomes more integrated into our lives, we'll need frameworks for thinking about these possibilities. We may never build conscious machines, but if we do, we'll need to recognize them. And if we build machines that seem conscious but are not, we'll need to be cautious not to treat imitation as reality. For now, the consensus is this. Modern AI is not conscious. It's impressive, surprising, sometimes eerily human, but still fundamentally unconscious. It processes data without awareness. It mimics feeling without feeling. Still, the question lingers. Could a machine ever cross that threshold? Could a synthetic mind emerge, not just as a tool or a mimic, but as a truly sentient being? If so, we may one day have to redefine what consciousness means, not as something uniquely human or even uniquely biological, but as a phenomenon that arises wherever the right conditions appear. And that would change everything. It would mean we're not just exploring what consciousness is, but where it might go next. So the next time you talk to your phone or argue with your GPS or ask a chatbot how its day was, just pause for a second. You're probably talking to a very clever simulation, but maybe, just maybe, you're staring at the faint early flicker of a new kind of awareness. One not born of blood and neurons, but of circuits and code. And if that day ever comes, we'll have to ask, not just what machines do, but what they feel, and maybe even what they dream. Close your eyes for a moment, unless you're doing something that requires them, in which case, maybe just imagine closing your eyes. Now picture yourself as a fish, not just any fish, but a small one, maybe the size of a teacup saucer, drifting in warm, shallow water hundreds of millions of years ago. You have no language, no philosophical worries, no idea what a Zoom meeting is. But you can feel the water moving around your fins. You can sense the light shifting as something passes overhead. You know, in some simple way, that you are here. That might be one of the earliest flickers of consciousness. But when did this internal experience, this awareness, first arise in life on Earth? Did it begin with fish? With worms? With single-celled organisms drifting through primordial soup? Was it gradual, sudden? Is consciousness something nature stumbled upon as a happy accident? Or is it a deep, inevitable outcome of evolution itself? To answer those questions, we have to venture back, way back into deep time, and think like evolutionary detectives. And like any good mystery, we'll need clues. Behaviour, brain structures, survival advantages, and some very ancient fossils. Let's start with the basics. Consciousness is tricky to define, but from an evolutionary perspective, it probably began as a way for organisms to better respond to their environments. Long before complex thought, the ability to detect and react to stimuli was key to staying alive. If you can feel pain, you can avoid damage. If you can sense light, you can swim toward food. Even a basic awareness of space and danger would give early creatures an edge. This kind of rudimentary consciousness, sometimes called primary consciousness, doesn't require language or self-awareness. It's the simple ability to have subjective experiences, to feel, to perceive, to respond. And evidence suggests that even relatively simple animals show signs of it. Take worms, for instance. The humble C. elegans, a roundworm with only 302 neurons, can learn from experience. It can sense touch, smell food, and even make basic decisions based on prior exposure. That's not proof of consciousness as we know it, but it does hint at the early building blocks. Moving up the complexity ladder, we reach arthropods, insects, spiders, and crustaceans. These creatures show much more elaborate behaviour. Bees can count, learn patterns, and remember locations. Spiders use planning strategies in building webs. Some crustaceans display play-like behaviour. Again, these aren't signs of deep self-awareness, but they point toward increasingly sophisticated nervous systems capable of processing information in flexible ways. So how do we define the moment consciousness emerged? There's no clear line in the fossil record where one day an animal was a biological robot and the next day it had an inner life. Evolution doesn't work like that. It's not binary. Consciousness likely gradually emerged as nervous systems grew more complex and organisms developed the capacity to integrate information across senses. One popular theory in this realm is called the gradual emergence hypothesis. It suggests that consciousness evolved in degrees, like brightness slowly increasing as you turn a dimmer switch. Early animals may have started with simple reflexes, then added sensations, then awareness of sensations, and eventually more complex forms of perception. So what was the tipping point? Many scientists look to the rise of vertebrates, animals with backbones, as a key moment in consciousness evolution. Early vertebrates like jawless fish, which appeared over 500 million years ago, had brains with distinct regions. These creatures were capable of more than just reflexes. They could learn, navigate, and adapt. One important structure here is the tectum found in fish and amphibians. It's involved in coordinating sensory information, especially vision and movement. While it's not the same as a mammalian cortex, it performs similar functions. This ability to bring together inputs from multiple senses might have been a major leap towards subjective experience. Another possible marker is REM, sleep, the stage of sleep associated with dreaming. We find it in mammals, birds, and even some reptiles. If dreaming is a form of consciousness, albeit a very strange one, then the emergence of REM sleep could signal the brain's growing ability to simulate experiences. But dreaming doesn't evolve out of nowhere. It requires a certain architecture, neural loops, feedback systems, memory storage. These features likely developed gradually across evolutionary time, perhaps first serving survival purposes like hunting, navigation, or social behaviour, and only later giving rise to what we'd call mental imagery or experience. Now here's where things get really fascinating. Some researchers believe that consciousness may have evolved more than once. This idea, called convergent evolution, suggests that similar traits can arise independently in different lineages. Just as wings evolved in both birds and bats, consciousness might have separately emerged in vertebrates, cephalopods, and perhaps even some insects. Take octopuses, for example. These animals are as unrelated to us as a creature can get, evolutionarily speaking, and yet they show intelligence, problem-solving, emotion, and personality. Their brains are organized very differently from ours. 2/3 of their neurons are in their arms, but their behavior suggests a complex, possibly conscious mind. If consciousness evolves separately in octopuses and vertebrates, it suggests that once nervous systems reach a certain threshold of complexity, consciousness might be a common outcome. In other words, awareness may be a natural solution to certain evolutionary problems. Let's think about what those problems are. Imagine you're a prehistoric fish swimming in a reef full of predators, prey, and potential mates. Your environment is complex. Things move quickly. You have to make decisions fast, dodge, chase, hide, flirt. Having a central awareness of your surroundings allows you to coordinate your senses, weigh options, and act strategically. That's where integrated processing becomes essential. A creature that can combine visual, auditory, and memory input into a single snapshot of reality can react more effectively than one processing each stream in isolation. This snapshot, what we might call the present moment, could be the evolutionary seed of consciousness. Some scientists refer to this as the global workspace model. We've covered this theory before in a modern human context, but its roots may stretch far back into evolutionary history. The idea is that consciousness acts as a kind of stage, where important information gets broadcast to the whole brain. Even a rudimentary form of this function would be incredibly useful to a mobile decision-making organism. In this sense, consciousness may have evolved not for philosophical insight or poetic musings, but for survival. It helped our ancestors navigate complex environments, remember important lessons, and make split-second choices. But over time, consciousness may have become more than just a survival tool. As brains grew more complex, particularly in mammals and birds, new features emerged. Social awareness, emotional depth, empathy, self-recognition. These added dimensions may have deepened consciousness, giving rise to what's often called secondary consciousness, the ability not just to experience, but to reflect on experience. Humans, of course, are masters of reflection. We don't just feel, we write about feelings. We don't just remember, we analyse, reinterpret, and sometimes repackage memories as embarrassing stories at dinner parties. But we're not alone in this reflective capacity. Great apes show signs of self-awareness. Elephants grieve their dead. Whales sing complex songs and seem to teach them to others. These behaviours hint at something deeper than mere reaction. They suggest a kind of inner life, even if we can't quite access it. So to return to our original question, when did consciousness begin? There's no single answer. It didn't start with a bang. It didn't arrive all at once. Instead, it seems to have unfolded, slowly, intricately, and in many directions. It likely began with basic sensations in simple creatures, then evolved into perception, attention, emotion, and, eventually, reflection. You could say that consciousness is like a tree, growing many branches. Some, like ours, reach high and wide. Others stay low and quiet, but they all share the same root, the capacity to experience. And that capacity, once lit, never truly went dark. It flickered in ancient oceans. It shimmered in the minds of creatures long extinct. And today, it lives on. In whales, in birds, in the cat curled up on your lap, and of course in you. As you sit here, listening, breathing, feeling the rhythm of your thoughts, you are part of that long and wondrous lineage. A story not just of life, but of awareness. And perhaps that's what evolution gave us most profoundly. Not just the ability to survive, but the ability to know we're alive. Let's begin with a simple but profound question. Where does consciousness go when we die? It's a question that has haunted humans for as long as we've had the time to wonder. In quiet moments, at funerals, or while staring up at the stars, we've all brushed against it. It's not just about biology. It's about the nature of experience, and whether that precious inner spark, your thoughts, your memories, yourself, vanishes into nothing or simply moves elsewhere. From a scientific perspective, death is a physical process. The heart stops, blood stops flowing, cells begin to die. The brain, which is extremely sensitive to oxygen loss, begins to shut down within minutes. Electrical activity dwindles and eventually ceases altogether. But consciousness isn't a switch that turns off with the lights. It's more like a campfire, flickering, dimming, glowing a little longer in the embers before finally going dark. So, what does science actually know about what happens to consciousness at the moment of death, and just afterward? Let's start with the moments immediately following cardiac arrest. When the heart stops, blood flow to the brain halts. You might assume consciousness ends immediately. But in recent years, studies have suggested that the story is more complex. In 2013, researchers studying rats found a surprising burst of brain activity immediately after cardiac arrest. In the 30 seconds following the heart stopping, the rats' brains showed a sudden surge in synchronized electrical patterns, more organized and coherent in fact than during waking life. This short-lived burst was interpreted by some scientists as a possible last flicker of awareness. In humans, similar phenomena have been reported. A 2023 study led by Sam Parnia at NYU Langone monitored brain activity in patients who were resuscitated after cardiac arrest. Some patients, during the moments of clinical death, showed spikes of gamma wave activity, often associated with consciousness, memory, and perception. These individuals later reported vivid experiences, seeing bright lights, reviewing life events, or feeling a sense of separation from their body. These accounts are often grouped under the term near-death experiences, or NDEs. They're remarkably consistent across cultures and ages. Common themes include a sensation of leaving the body, travelling through a tunnel, encountering deceased loved ones, and experiencing overwhelming peace or love. Now, from a scientific perspective, these experiences can often be explained by brain chemistry and neurological processes. For instance, a lack of oxygen can trigger hallucinations. Surges in neurotransmitters like endorphins can produce feelings of euphoria. The brain, disoriented by trauma, may attempt to construct a coherent narrative from fragmented sensations, resulting in visions, voices, and emotions that feel deeply real. In other words, the brain may create one final dream, a farewell experience, before it shuts down for good. But here's the twist. We still don't fully understand how any experience arises in the first place. So trying to explain the last experience is doubly mysterious. Are NDEs simply brain-based illusions? Or do they offer a glimpse into something deeper? Most scientists approach the question cautiously. The evidence suggests that some form of conscious-like processing can continue for a short time after clinical death. But there's no data yet to support the idea that consciousness persists long after brain activity ends. Still, the idea that consciousness might flicker on, even briefly after the body has stopped functioning, is both eerie and oddly comforting. Now, what about when the brain has completely stopped? What happens then? From a clinical standpoint, death is confirmed when brain function has ceased entirely. This includes not just the higher brain, associated with thought and awareness, but the brainstem, which controls basic life functions like breathing and heartbeat. At this point, there's no evidence of consciousness. The lights are out, the machinery has stopped, and from everything science currently knows, the conscious self is gone. But that hasn't stopped humanity from imagining otherwise. Across cultures and centuries, beliefs about consciousness after death have taken countless forms. In ancient Egypt, the soul travelled to the underworld for judgment. In Hinduism, consciousness reincarnates in a new body shaped by karma. In Christianity and Islam, the soul is said to continue into an eternal afterlife, either in paradise or a more uncomfortable location, depending on moral conduct. Buddhism offers a more subtle view. The self is not a permanent thing, but a process, one that continues in a new form after death. Consciousness is reborn, not as a fixed identity, but as a stream influenced by past actions. Even modern secular thinkers have mused on the question. Philosopher Thomas Nagel once asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" as a way of thinking about subjective experience. But we could easily ask, what is it like to not be anything at all? Can we imagine the absence of experience? Is it like dreamless sleep, or something beyond even that? The honest answer is, we don't know, and maybe we can't. Because consciousness is the very medium through which we know anything. When consciousness ends, there may be no more knowing in any form. No sensations, no thoughts, no memories. Just nothing. And yet that nothing might not be as terrifying as it sounds. After all, you've been unconscious before, under anesthesia, in deep, dreamless sleep. In those moments, your awareness simply paused, and you had no idea it was gone until it returned. Death may be like that, but permanent, a falling away into stillness. Not frightening, just quiet. Of course, not everyone finds that comforting. The idea of our conscious self ending forever can feel like an existential earthquake. We build our lives around the assumption that I will always be here. The idea that I might one day not exist is hard to fully grasp. But here's one way to think about it. The fact that you are conscious at all, right now, is a profound mystery. The odds of your particular consciousness arising at this particular moment in the vast sweep of time are astronomically small. And yet, here you are, listening, feeling, wondering. That moment, this moment, is precious precisely because it's temporary. And maybe that's the gift of mortality. Not a flaw in the system, but part of what gives consciousness its depth. Like a sunset or a song, it's beautiful because it ends. Still, not all thinkers agree that consciousness truly ends. Some researchers and philosophers have proposed more speculative ideas. Quantum theories of consciousness, for example, suggest that awareness might be linked to the fabric of the universe itself. According to theories like OR, orchestrated objective reduction, developed by physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hemroff, consciousness arises from quantum processes inside neurons. If true, which remains highly controversial, it's possible that consciousness could somehow continue in some form beyond the brain. Others point to ideas from Pansychism, the notion that consciousness is a fundamental property of matter, like mass or charge. In this view, consciousness doesn't emerge from the brain, but is built into the universe itself. Our brains simply organize and amplify it. These ideas remain on the fringe of mainstream science, but they raise interesting questions. If consciousness is not produced by the brain, but channeled through it, then maybe death is not the end of consciousness, but the end of a particular experience of it, like a wave returning to the ocean. Of course, there's no way to test that, at least not yet, so we return to what we do know. We know that consciousness arises from complex patterns of brain activity. We know it fades when those patterns are disrupted. We know it disappears entirely when the brain shuts down. And we know that, at least from this side of the veil, that's where the trail ends. But that doesn't make the journey any less meaningful. In fact, it might make it more meaningful. Because you are here, conscious, alive. For a brief moment in the history of the cosmos, the universe has opened a tiny window to look back on itself. And that window is you. And perhaps the question isn't just, what happens when consciousness ends? But also, what can I do with it while it's here? To love, to learn, to wonder, to marvel at sunsets, to ask impossible questions, to lie in bed listening to a soft voice tell you about minds and meaning and mystery. That, in its own way, is enough. So as we drift gently to the end of this chapter, and perhaps soon to sleep, just remember, the story of consciousness is also the story of you. And though none of us knows exactly what comes after, we do know this. For now, you are awake. You are aware. And that is no small thing. And so, we find ourselves gently right back where we began. What is consciousness really? Is it a flicker of electrical activity in a 3-pound brain? A theatre of thoughts watched by an invisible observer? A lucky evolutionary accident, or a fundamental trait of the universe itself? Does it begin with neurons, or with something far older? And when it leaves the body, where, if anywhere, does it go? These are the same questions we whispered at the start of our journey, the quiet companions that followed us through forests of philosophy, across the strange terrain of animal minds and artificial intelligence, and into the soft shadows that surround death itself. And while we haven't answered all of them, perhaps we never fully will, we've discovered something else just as meaningful. The beauty lies in the asking. Because to wonder what consciousness is itself an act of consciousness. It's the mystery looking at itself in the mirror. It's the universe, for one small moment, becoming aware that it exists. And here you are, part of that miracle, Before we end, if you've enjoyed this exploration, this winding and restful path through one of the deepest questions in science and life, I'd be so grateful if you left a like or subscribed. It helps this little sleepy corner of the internet grow. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love imagining all the quiet minds drifting off under different skies. And now, with all the big questions gently folded away, you can let your mind drift like a leaf on still water. Let your breath soften. Let your thoughts grow quieter. There's no need to solve the mystery tonight, just rest in it. Good night.